Mamdani scrambles as NYU Langone's $2.6 billion research campus freezes faculty recruitment. NYU Langone doesn't recruit faculty the way most hospitals do. It recruits the way elite sports franchises recruit. Years of relationship building, targeted offers designed around a single researcher's specific needs, startup packages that can run into the tens of millions of dollars for a single hire, all built on the understanding that one world-class cancer biologist or one breakthrough immunologist can generate enough grant revenue, clinical trial funding, and institutional prestige to justify the entire investment many times over across a decade. That's not an exaggeration. Academic medical centers operate on a model most people outside the industry never see clearly. A top-tier faculty researcher at a place like NYU Langone doesn't just teach and publish. She runs a lab that pulls in federal grants from the National Institutes of Health, private foundation funding, pharmaceutical partnerships, and clinical trial contracts that collectively generate millions in annual revenue flowing directly into the institution. Lose one of those researchers to a competitor. To Mass General in Boston, to Penn Medicine in Philadelphia, to UCSF in San Francisco. And you don't just lose a name on a door. You lose a revenue stream, a grant portfolio, and a pipeline of graduate students and postdocs who chose NYU specifically because that researcher was there. NYU Langone spent the last 15 years building itself into one of the most aggressively competitive academic medical centers in the country, rising from a respected but mid-tier institution into a top 5 research hospital by virtually every major ranking. A climb driven almost entirely by a deliberate, expensive strategy of recruiting elite faculty away from competitors who'd held those rankings for decades longer. That climb didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen cheaply. The institution invested heavily in physical infrastructure, compensation packages, and a cultural shift toward treating faculty recruitment with the same intensity and financial seriousness that a Fortune 500 company brings to acquiring a competitor. Dean Robert Grossman, widely credited with engineering the turnaround before his retirement, built a system where every major hire was treated as an institutional investment with a projected return, tracked and measured the way a private equity firm tracks portfolio companies. The centerpiece of that ongoing strategy is a $2.6 billion research campus expansion, a multi-phase project adding laboratory space, clinical research floors, and specialized facilities designed specifically to give newly recruited faculty the kind of physical infrastructure that makes the difference between choosing NYU and choosing somewhere else. State-of-the-art imaging suites, biosafety level 3 labs that most competing institutions can't match without years of their own construction, dedicated floors for translational research, the work that takes a discovery from a lab bench to a clinical trial to a patient's bedside, designed with input from the very faculty the expansion was built to attract. 3 weeks ago, that recruitment machine stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. The provost's office sent an internal directive to every department chair across the medical school. All new faculty recruitment offers are paused effective immediately, pending a financial review expected to take at least 4 months. No new startup packages, no new lab build-outs, no new negotiations with candidates who, in some cases, had been in conversation with NYU for over a year. The mayor, whose administration has publicly cited NYU Langone's expansion as evidence that New York remains the global capital of biomedical research, said nothing about the freeze when reporters asked about it at an unrelated press conference last week. His press secretary referred questions to the university, which declined to comment beyond confirming the pause was underway. There's a number buried inside the financial review memo that triggered this freeze, and it connects directly to a policy change most people assumed would only affect real estate developers and commercial landlords, not hospitals. Once you see it, the silence from City Hall makes considerably more sense. You don't have to work in medicine or research for this story to matter to you. Any city that depends on its academic medical centers as economic engines. And in New York, the healthcare and education sectors together employ more people than finance and tech combined. Is one policy miscalculation away from watching its competitive advantage in research talent walk out the door to a city that's been waiting for exactly this kind of opening? Subscribe before we continue, because the number we're about to walk through didn't come from a press release or a public budget hearing. It came from NYU Langone's own internal financial modeling, shared with department chairs in the same memo that announced the freeze. And it tells a story the administration clearly wasn't ready to tell publicly. January 2026. As part of a broader package of fiscal reforms aimed at closing the city's structural deficit, Mayor Mamdani's administration finalizes changes to the way New York City assesses property taxes on institutional landholders. Universities, hospitals, and large nonprofits that have historically enjoyed significant tax exemptions on the real estate they own and operate across the 5 boroughs. The reform doesn't eliminate those exemptions entirely. What it does is narrow the definition of which institutional properties qualify for full exemption, specifically excluding any building or facility whose primary use is defined as commercial research rather than direct patient care or classroom instruction. The policy addresses a real and long-documented inequity. For decades, critics have pointed out that some of the city's wealthiest institutional landholders, universities with multi-billion-dollar endowments, hospital systems generating hundreds of millions in annual surplus, pay little or no property tax on vast real estate portfolios, effectively shifting the tax burden onto residential and small commercial property owners who don't enjoy the same exemptions. The reform's sponsors cited studies estimating that full market taxation of currently exempt institutional properties citywide would generate over $1.2 billion in additional annual revenue, a significant contribution toward closing the deficit without raising taxes on residents or small businesses. Nobody seriously disputes that the underlying inequity is real. The question, as with nearly every policy in this series, is what happens at the specific point where a reasonable-sounding reform meets the actual financial structure of the institutions it applies to. Here's what the reform's own fiscal impact analysis didn't model with the precision it modeled almost everything else. NYU Langone's $2.6 billion research campus expansion was financed through a combination of tax-exempt municipal bonds, philanthropic commitments, and projected future revenue from the faculty researchers the new facilities were specifically designed to recruit. The entire financing model, the bond covenants, the debt service schedule, the projected return on investment presented to the Board of Trustees when they approved the expansion, was built on the assumption that the research buildings housing those faculty would maintain their full property tax exemption for the duration of the bond repayment period, typically 30 years. The new policy reclassifies a significant portion of NYU Langone's expansion, specifically the laboratory and commercial research floors, as opposed to the patient care and teaching floors, as non-exempt. That reclassification doesn't just add a new line item to the university's annual budget. It retroactively changes the cost basis on which the entire expansion's financing was structured, adding an estimated $38 million in annual property tax liability that was never included in the original debt service projections presented to bondholders. $38 million a year doesn't sound catastrophic for an institution of NYU Langone's size, and on its own terms, it probably isn't. But here's the number from the internal memo that changes the math entirely. NYU Langone's faculty recruitment startup packages, the lab build-out costs, the guaranteed salary support, the equipment budgets that make a competitive offer possible, average roughly $4.2 million per senior hire in the biomedical sciences, funded almost entirely out of the same discretionary capital pool that now has to absorb $38 million in new, unplanned annual tax liability. Do the division and the freeze makes immediate, uncomfortable sense. $38 million in unexpected annual costs, divided by $4.2 million per faculty recruitment package, equals approximately 9 fewer senior hires per year that the institution can fund without either cutting existing programs or going back to bondholders to restructure debt on terms that would almost certainly be less favorable than the original issuance. NYU Langone wasn't making 9 senior hires a year casually. That number represented the core of its competitive strategy against peer institutions, the precise mechanism by which it climbed from mid-tier to top 5 over the past 15 years. Losing 9 recruitment slots a year isn't a budget trim. It's a structural downgrade of the institution's competitive position, implemented not by a strategic decision from the board, but by an unintended consequence of a tax policy that was never designed with research university financing in mind. The city's fiscal note projected $1.2 billion in new annual revenue from institutional property tax reform citywide, spread across every qualifying university, hospital, and nonprofit in the 5 boroughs. That's the number City Hall highlighted publicly, framed as asking the city's wealthiest institutions to contribute more fairly to the tax base that supports the neighborhoods they operate in. What that number didn't break down anywhere in the public materials, was how many of those institutions had active expansion projects financed under bond covenants that assumed the old exemption structure would remain in place, and how many of those projects would face exactly the kind of budget crisis NYU Langone is now working through. Step into the position of a cancer biologist sitting at MD Anderson in Houston right now, because this is where the story stops being institutional and becomes intensely personal. She's 44, runs a lab with $3.8 million in active knee funding, and has spent the last 14 months in serious conversation with NYU Langone about relocating to New York. Her husband is from Queens. Her kids would be closer to grandparents. The personal pull toward New York was always there, but personal pull alone doesn't move a researcher with an established lab, active grants, and a team of graduate students who'd all need to relocate. The institutional offer has to be competitive enough to justify the enormous professional disruption of uprooting an entire research operation. The startup package NYU offered: new lab space in the expansion building, 2 postdoc positions funded for 3 years, a generous equipment budget, and a salary that reflected just how seriously the institution wanted her, was specifically designed to make New York competitive against a counteroffer from Dana-Farber in Boston that came in slightly higher on base salary but lower on lab space and infrastructure. She'd visited the expansion site twice, walked through the floors her lab would eventually occupy, met the department chair who'd personally championed her recruitment over 3 rounds of internal committee review. 3 weeks ago, her recruiting contact at NYU called to say the offer was on hold indefinitely, not withdrawn, not renegotiated, just frozen, pending a financial review with no confirmed end date, delivered in the kind of careful, apologetic language that made it clear the person on the other end of the phone was as frustrated as she was, but genuinely couldn't promise anything. She has until August to give Dana-Farber an answer. Dana-Farber isn't waiting on a municipal tax policy review in a city 1,000 miles away. Dana-Farber's offer is sitting on her desk right now, fully funded, ready to sign, with a department chair in Boston who calls her every 2 weeks to check in and remind her, politely, that the offer won't stay open forever if she signs with Dana-Farber. And the odds increase with every week NYU's freeze continues. NYU doesn't just lose one faculty member. It loses her $3.8 million knee portfolio, which transfers with her to whatever institution she joins. It loses the 2 graduate students who would have followed her to New York, each of whom represents years of training investment that now accrues to a competing program. It loses the clinical trial partnerships she would have established with NYU's hospital network, partnerships that pharmaceutical companies specifically seek out when choosing where to run their next-generation oncology trials. And it loses the next generation of researchers who would have chosen NYU specifically because she was there, the compounding reputational effect that takes years to build and weeks to lose. Multiply her by the roughly 9 senior hires per year that the freeze effectively eliminates, and multiply each of those hires by the grant portfolios, graduate students, and clinical partnerships they would have brought with them, and the $38 million in new property tax revenue the city is collecting from NYU Langone starts looking less like a clean budget win and more like a trade the city made without fully accounting for what it was giving up on the other side of the ledger. The researchers NYU loses don't disappear from the national talent pool. They go to Boston. They go to Philadelphia. They go to Houston, San Francisco, San Diego. Every one of them, a city whose academic medical centers have spent years positioning themselves to absorb exactly this kind of competitive stumble from a rival. Mass General Brigham in Boston has been expanding its own research campus for 3 years. Penn Medicine in Philadelphia just completed a new translational research building with empty floors, specifically designed to accommodate incoming faculty from exactly the kind of institution that might suddenly find itself unable to close its own recruitment offers. These aren't hypothetical competitors reacting in real time. These are institutions that have been building capacity for years, waiting patiently for a moment exactly like this one. The talent pipeline doesn't pause alongside NYU's recruitment freeze. It redirects, quietly, permanently, one offer letter at a time, to institutions in cities that didn't just change the tax rules on buildings full of scientists mid-expansion. None of this means the underlying reform was wrong in principle. Wealthy institutions occupying vast, tax-exempt real estate portfolios in a city running a multi-billion-dollar deficit is a legitimate policy concern that serious people on both sides of the debate acknowledge. That part of the premise holds up. What doesn't hold up is the assumption that a reclassification of research space could be applied to institutions mid-expansion, with active bond covenants structured around the old exemption, without triggering exactly the kind of recruitment freeze NYU Langone just implemented. A transition period matching the remaining term of existing bond issuances, or a grandfather clause for expansion projects already under construction when the policy took effect, might have preserved the reform's revenue goals without accidentally handing NYU Langone's competitors the biggest faculty recruitment advantage any of them have had in over a decade. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a tax reform correctly identifies institutions that should be contributing more to the city's tax base, but the timing of that reform hands a permanent competitive advantage to rival cities whose medical centers were already waiting for exactly this kind of opening, is that fiscal responsibility? Or is that a policy that trades long-term institutional talent for short-term budget arithmetic? Let us know where you land in the comments. And we're not done pulling this thread. Next, we're looking at how many other university-affiliated research expansions across the 5 boroughs are running the same bond covenant math behind closed doors right now.